Lord be with you.
And with your spirit.
A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Mark. Jesus and his disciples left from there and began a journey throughout Galilee, but he did not wish anyone to know about it. He was teaching his disciples and telling them, "The Son of Man is to be handed over to men, and they will kill him. And 3 days after his death, the Son of Man will rise." They did not understand this saying, and they were afraid to question him. They came to Capernaum, and once inside the house, he began to ask them, "What were you arguing about on the way?" But they remained silent. They had been discussing among themselves on the way who was the greatest. Then he sat down, called the 12, and said to them, "If anyone wishes to be first, he shall be the last of all and the servant of all." Taking a child, he placed it in their midst, and putting his arms around it, he said to them, "Whoever receives one child such as this in my name receives me, and whoever receives me receives not me, but the one who sent me." The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ.
Have you ever been accused of acting like a child? Not me, of course. That's usually a negative thing, right? It means you're acting immature, maybe kind of selfish, arguing about silly little things, maybe even a temper tantrum. Generally, it's a negative connotation, right? So why in today's gospel did Jesus tell us to act like children? Especially since the disciples were already acting like children. Well, actually, he wasn't telling us to act childish. He was telling us to be childlike. But not childlike in innocence and obedience. That's going to be our gospel message in 2 weeks. Instead, today he's telling us to be childlike in status. So let's set the scene a little. This is the second time in Mark's gospel that Jesus is attempting to describe the Messiah as the suffering servant to his disciples, his main guys. And if you remember last week, Jesus asked them, he said, "Who do you say that I am?" And the disciples, Peter said, "You are the Christ." And so then he started to explain to them that he was going to suffer and die. But even after recognizing Jesus as the Messiah, the disciples didn't want to hear about him suffering. Remember Peter tried to rebuke him and say, no, please don't let that happen. And Jesus said, "Get behind me, Satan." And in today's gospel reading, they've just come down from a mountain. It's a very special mountain. It's called Mount Tabor. Does anybody remember what happened on Mount Tabor? Transfiguration, right. So now, Jesus had climbed this mountain with 3 of his apostles, Peter, James, and John, and had given them a glimpse of his holy majesty. And so now they're just off that mountain, and they're journeying through Galilee on their way back to Capernaum, and Jesus again tries to tell them that he's going to suffer and die. But they're not understanding. I mean, right here, Jesus is revealing to them the most significant event in human history, and they're ignoring him. They're afraid to ask questions because they don't want to hear the answers. So instead, they're acting childish. They're arguing and fighting with each other over who is the greatest. Now, I kind of understand where they're coming from. I mean, after they've been on this mountain, the Transfiguration, after Jesus reveals his majesty to them, they're even more convinced that he's the Messiah. And so throughout their whole lives, throughout their whole culture, they grew up believing that the Messiah was going to come and restore Israel to its magnificence in the world, going to bring it back to the time of King David. And so now they know that the Messiah is with them. Soon, Jesus is going to be king. And them being in his inner circle, they're going to rise to prominence with him. They're going to be like royalty. They're going to be the most powerful men in the country. So now they're bickering between each other about which one's going to be greater. Which one is going to have the better job, the more prominence, the office in the corner office in the palace, right? And I could just picture Jesus kind of shaking his head in frustration, trying to get them to understand. So he gathers them together, and with his ultimate love and consummate patience, he explains that if anyone wishes to be first, he shall be last of all and the servant of all. That means putting others before you to help and to care for them. That means in humble service, willing to lay down your life for the benefit of another. That's the real meaning of greatness. And then to help get his point across, he takes a child and puts him in their midst. Now, understand that at that time, children were very insignificant. They were unimportant. They were the lowest level of society. No Jewish man would ever serve a child. So Jesus then, he picks up the child and holds this child and says, "Whoever receives one such child in my name receives me." He's not only humbling himself to receive the child, in other words, to serve the child. What he's saying is he's also comparing himself to a child, the lowliest of society. He's identifying with that child. He's bringing himself down to the status of that child. And he's saying, if you receive that child, you receive me. He's telling them that the greatest person of all will be the least. He's come to serve every single person, not to be served by any person. And then, in the ultimate act of love, the great Messiah is going to give his life for everyone. Because that's the will of God. And he's telling them that if they want to be great too, they also must become like that child at the lowest level of society and to serve all others. That's what defines greatness. Now, trust me, I know that this can be a really tough concept. Nobody likes to be a servant or a slave. Nobody likes to be taken advantage of. In fact, we work hard to develop prestige and respect and position. That's our culture today. That's our society. And that's what defines success. That defines authority. And for some people, that defines identity. So it's hard for us to push aside that prestige. And let me say that there's nothing wrong with striving to be successful. But it's how we perceive ourselves in that success, our ego, our conceit, and how we act upon it that can get us into trouble. We can either strut around saying, I'm the greatest, and expect people to serve us, or we can accept our success and humbly use it for the good of others. And it's then that we're no longer selfishly serving ourselves, but now we're doing the will of God. So I have some homework for us this week. This week, let's challenge ourselves. Let's challenge ourselves to reflect on our humility, our own personal humility. Do we look to serve, or do we look to be served? What's our attitude towards others? Do we humbly lower ourselves for the sake of others? Think about that. Because it's only when we become the lowest that we truly become our greatest.